Okay, so now I do want to turn to Max Blumenthal, who I'm told is joining us live from his car.
I have no sound.
He has no sound, he says. We'll try to get him sound. That would be good for him to have sound.
And you got it. Now I can hear you.
You can hear me? I know, Max, you enjoy nothing more than hearing my voice, so hopefully you can hear it now.
Well, you're looking great, and you're looking rested and ready down in Rio. I have to confess I wasn't able to get a front row seat for Netanyahu's speech. I was out with the protest. I've been out with the protesters since about noon, and was treated to various volleys of percussion grenades, tear gas, pepper spray, and yeah. But I wasn't surprised reading the transcript of Netanyahu's speech or, seeing the lowlights. I wasn't surprised with anything that took place.
I'm shocked, Max, because I thought I spotted you in the audience next to Jerry Nadler and Josh Gottheimer applauding Netanyahu for saying how great of a job Joe Biden and Donald Trump have done in supporting Israel. Maybe I mistook you for somebody else.
No, I got I was backstage with Netanyahu and Pastor John Hagee, though, but I wasn't in the photo. Tony Perkins got in the way from the Family Research Council. So yeah, I mainly just, saw the day of rage that erupted around the Capitol.
So describe to us the security situation in D.C. right now, because I was in D.C. not too long ago while the NATO summit was happening. And, they basically turned the convention center area into a fortress. They have all kinds of militarized police patrolling and checkpoints, and you can hardly get from one street to another. And you told me earlier today that there's something comparable going on with respect to the Netanyahu speech, which would be pretty amazing because it's not that uncommon for foreign leaders to come address joint sessions of Congress. It happens actually pretty frequently from Japan or India or wherever. But evidently, when our so-called greatest ally or the only democracy in the Middle East sends its prime minister or head of government to come address our legislative branch, they have to crack down in such extreme fashion in order to enable Bibi to have a wonderfully seamless address and receive all his endless ovations. So just describe what the security situation has been like.
Yeah, great question. I was actually shocked at how many police were on the streets. And I got the sense that the police, through whatever coordination mechanisms they were using, whether it was Amtrak police, U.S. Capitol Police, Park Police, or the NYPD, which sent 200 officers to D.C., they all were being prepared for some kind of Hamas attack or the possibility of Iran using its forces within this protest movement to actually stage some kind of lethal attack on the U.S. Capitol or on Union Station itself, which is next to the U.S. Capitol. So the entire Capitol was surrounded with rings of militarized police. There was nowhere you could go where you didn't encounter police who looked like they were dressed. The Montgomery County Police looked like they were dressed to go to a Renaissance fair. Like they had their shield, their club, they were wearing full body armor. It was 95 degrees out. It was like a sauna. And they were ready for a reenactment of a Braveheart battle scene. It was absolutely absurd. The police were ordered to wear their gas masks at all times. The DC police had tons of undercovers in the crowd who were obvious. Tons of surveillance, helicopters overhead, and lots of tactical police, along with less lethal weaponry, rubber-coated steel bullets, as I said, percussion grenades. There was an initial kind of tussle with some protesters, and they pepper sprayed a lot of people, including journalists, in the face. I was near that, and there was nothing about the protest that was violent. So what really struck me was that this all took place. This gigantic show of force. I should mention also the Amtrak police were not letting anyone in Union Station at all without a ticket. And this is a major gathering place for just people after work and people on Capitol Hill. Right after Donald Trump's near assassination attempt, which was obviously or the result of a Secret Service failure, or if you want to get conspiratorial, Secret Service stand down. And in the shadow of January 6th, which was the last time I saw the Capitol covered in that much fencing and fortification, people in DC were referring to it as Fort Netanyahu, kind of half jokingly. The last time I saw it like that was after January 6th, and I was at the January 6th protest, not as a protester. I just, wanted to observe what was taking place there. And it was obvious the police stood down. There were hardly any police there, and they allowed this riot to take place and to rampage through the Capitol with very little resistance. So it really kind of highlights who's in charge right now. We also have Joe Biden shrinking from public view. Many people are wondering where Joe Biden is. He's supposed to meet Netanyahu tomorrow, and I don't believe he's addressed the U.S. public yet to explain why he withdrew from the presidential race. So Netanyahu was referred to by Dana Bash at CNN as akin to a U.S. president delivering a State of the Union address. This really tells you how much power Israel has over our political system, even though, as we can discuss, Netanyahu appeared more isolated than he's ever been.
Well, Max, on January 6th, you may not have stormed the Capitol, but I would surmise that your mere presence there desecrated the temple of democracy. So I'm not sure you should have admitted that in public, because it implicates you in that day that will go down in history as like a double Pearl Harbor times 9/11. I wanted to ask
definitely,
you, I wanted to ask you, you read the transcript of Netanyahu's speech. Netanyahu did bring up that there was this alleged plot that was Iranian-backed to assassinate Trump. Now, there had been also these alleged plots against John Bolton and Mike Pompeo in retaliation for the drone assassination of Soleimani that Trump ordered in January of 2020. And they tried to connect that to the assassination attempt last weekend. So I'm not sure how valid that connection was. Obviously, it could be political opportunistic for that to be connected. But I wanted to get your take on how do you distinguish the nature of Republican support for Israel at this point versus the nature of Democratic support for Israel at this point, particularly within Congress, because I don't know that I can really recall many times when Republican members of the House have been so vociferous in their hooting and hollering and cheering for virtually anything. I mean, when Netanyahu lauded Trump for being such a stalwart supporter of Israel, it looked like all the Republicans were having a collective orgasm. Whereas the Democrats now at least have to give the appearance of being more tepid. Now, I think they're signaling tepidness toward Netanyahu himself, who they can villainize and try to separate from Israel writ large, and just use Netanyahu as this boogeyman because he has been more affiliated with Republicans over the years. Remember, Netanyahu basically endorsed Mitt Romney over Barack Obama in 2012, so this would be nothing particularly new for him. But the fervor among Republicans did stand out to me. As you may know, I was at the Republican convention last week in Milwaukee and went around asking a lot of Republican members of the House how they reconcile the idea of America First with also, declaring their unshakable support for Israel. And let's just say their answers were always not especially coherent. So how do you distinguish the nature of Republican support versus Democratic support for Israel as of today in July 2024, at least vis-a-vis the elected official class in Congress?
Well, just first on the Iranian plot, I mean, the source for that plot was one unnamed human source, which could be anyone. And it seems like the plot was kind of concocted to kind of lay the groundwork for Netanyahu to pin Trump's assassination on Iran and to interrupt diplomacy with Iran. So who could the human source could have been someone introduced to Israeli intelligence. And, there's a history of that going back to the Cafe Milano plot, the phony plot against this Iranian opposition figure, Masih Alinejad, who's paid by the U.S. government to advocate for war with Iran. And so that's highly suspect. With the Republican Party today, there are so many contradictions that you're so good at exposing and pointing out about the hypocrisy of America Firsters cheering a figure like Netanyahu. And within the America First movement, there are those who seem to support Israel or Netanyahu on the most puerile basis simply because they look at the protesters outside and see blue-haired, a few blue-haired gender fluid people wearing funny clothes who are giving the finger to the cops, and they just decide they hate them and that they hate queers for Palestine, and Palestine is woke, and therefore Israel is the right side to support.
And Max, Bibi played into that today. Yeah. Bibi said in his remarks something like, "Oh, and we have these gays for Palestine who are always out protesting on college campuses." So he was playing right into the beating heart of the culture war argument that Republicans use for their support for Israel.
Yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene condemning Jewish Voice for Peace for staging a kind of protest sit-in inside the U.S. Capitol because, she had been under so much attack by the media for January 6th. And she said, well, here's the insurrection, and the liberal media supports it. Is so puerile and so detached from what America First should be about. The only Republican you see really embracing it in a principled way is Thomas Massie, who said, I'm not going to be part of a PR operation for the State Department and for war with Iran by being a part of this speech. But you don't feel the Christian Zionist enthusiasm from a lot of the Freedom Caucus figures. You feel like, well, they have nothing to gain by opposing Israel or supporting Palestine Solidarity Movement, which is overwhelmingly progressive and would reject their support. Then you have Christian Zionists who really have been cultivated by the Israel lobby as what they, I think it was AIPAC, an AIPAC official referred to it as Israel's safety belt and the Bible Belt. And with the Israel lobby, you have a very top-heavy institution. They don't have a grassroots base. And so in the early 80s, they started cultivating evangelicals and did so very successfully. And now you have a generation of Republican congressmen who see they have no interest in discussing the issues. For them, this is about revelation. This is about creating a landing pad for the Messiah. You met some of them at the Republican National Convention. And John Hagee, the leading Christian Zionist figure in the United States, who heads Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, Texas, has thousands and thousands of parishioners, is extremely wealthy through all the money he takes in. His organization, Christians United for Israel, was actually set up by AIPAC, and he has been almost created as this important political figure exclusively within the Republican Party by AIPAC. So this is, in some ways, it's a positive development for the Israel lobby. They had feared that there would be anti-Semitism in Middle America, that evangelicals wouldn't want to support the Jewish state, and so they managed to pull off this feat. But at the same time, if you actually look at AIPAC's positioning, its rhetoric, they're hiring more and more people out of Republican offices on Capitol Hill. They're focusing increasingly on the Republican side. They are losing massive support, not just among the progressive grassroots, but among elected Democrats. And you saw over half of the House Democrats boycotted, close to half of the Democratic senators boycotted the speech. So AIPAC's strength had always been that Israel was a bipartisan issue, that there was no daylight between either party in Israel, and that's gone. And this is really the legacy of Netanyahu, who, as you know, and probably most people watching know, is a card-carrying Republican who spent a lot of his time as an opposition leader in the 1990s, hanging out at AIPAC offices and palling around with mostly Republican politicians and lobbyists. And he found that he was more successful selling them on his idea of Israel as a bulwark against terrorism and on the idea that the Palestinian state was an existential threat to Israel. So liberal Zionism, which the Democratic Party had always adopted as its official ideology, which held out that Israel wanted to make peace if they could just find the right Palestinian partner, has been basically extinguished, not just within Israel, where Netanyahu and the Likud party and more extreme elements within the settlement movement, the Messianic settlement movement, the Temple movement, which we can talk about more, are incipient, but also within the Democratic Party, there just really is no base for. Israel can be democratic and exclusively Jewish. So I broke away from the Palestine Solidarity protest, and I went to a small liberal Zionist protest outside the Capitol where they were trying to square the contradiction of Israel being still a potentially good democratic country and Netanyahu just being the bad boogeyman. This was put on by a liberal Jewish group called Trua, and they brought there are many Israelis there who are family members of the hostages who blame Netanyahu for extending the war and allowing their family members to languish and die in Gaza, usually from Israeli bombings. But the things they were saying were just delusional. It was like they were talking about an Israel that exists in the canyons of their imagination and not the Israel that we see today, where Netanyahu is basically a centrist figure. They were saying America and Israel were founded on democratic values and the belief in equality, and we need to get back to that. So that's just gone. And so too are the hopes, I think, of the families who wanted a deal, who thought, well, there could be a deal with Hamas. Hamas clearly wants a deal. They want to release the hostages and get Palestinian prisoners out. I think Netanyahu wants the hostages to die or be killed, and so does his support base in Israel. And there's strong evidence that that's almost an official policy, because it deprives Hamas of leverage. And if there are no hostages in Hamas's hands, there's nothing that can stop Israel from rampaging through Gaza, maintaining a permanent presence, and tormenting and killing larger numbers of Palestinian prisoners in Israel's dungeons.
So, Max, I want to read to you a quote that was given to me by Congressman Corey Mills, Republican of Florida, last week at the Republican convention. He says that he believes that Donald Trump understands that the Constitution is, quote, framed upon what are the Christian Judeo beliefs. And Mills therefore says that, quote, you understand the prophecy of Revelations. Now, he says Revelations plural, and it's Revelations singular in the Bible. So a lot of people who claim to believe the apocalyptic final book of the Bible don't understand what the book actually is titled, which is odd. But he says, and it talks about the people of Israel who are God's children and who will fly on the back of an eagle. It talks about the mountain of God, which is essentially Russia. So that's Congressman Corey Mills of Florida talking about the book of Revelation, which is literally apocalyptic, eschatology, as the basis for his imperative to support Israel. Now, he'll also tie it in with what he claims are U.S. strategic interests and this kind of thing that are of a more secular bent. But the biblical imperative really is there, and it's potent, and unless you just disbelieve that their religiosity is authentic, I don't know how it couldn't be hugely influential in dictating the worldview on this stuff. And if we could also show you the clip of me interviewing Congressman Andy Barr of Kentucky, also at the Republican convention last week. Let's go to that.
Terrorism. Do you see there being any tension between the America First point of view and also so stalwartly supporting Israel? It seems like there might be some tension there. At least some conservatives have complaints about that.
If anyone is confused about that, let me set the record straight. Being pro-Israel is America First. plain and simple.
So there you have it, Max. That's about as unambiguous a statement as you can get, I would think. It reminds me of George H.W. Bush saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But this is about Israel first and America first apparently being interchangeable concepts for these Republicans. At least that's how they work through the seeming contradictions in their own mind. So what do you make of those quotes?
I mean, I understand the thinking. And with respect to Corey Mills, he's expressing a very common view of Christian Zionists who are premillennial dispensationalists who believe that there will be a series of dispensations or crises and wars that herald the return of Christ. And the major war will be between Gog and Magog, with Iran, Russia, and China comprising the forces of Magog, who will be destroyed by the holy forces fighting from Jerusalem. This is all articulated in John Hagee's kind of like pulp novel, like books like Jerusalem Countdown. And, you know, it might sound absolutely insane because it is, but this is how it's understood and why there's so much support for conflict with Iran within the Christian Zionist quote unquote heartland. And it all makes sense, and it all sounds like it could be America first too, because Israel, well, they think Israel's like us. Israel's supported by us. Their leader speaks English. He's not Hamas. They don't have beards. They're not swarthy guys who live in tunnels, who worship Islam. Like, they seem to be more relatable. Netanyahu does a really good job of seeming American and Israeli at the same time. But when the shit hits the fan and conflict with Iran actually takes place, it's not going to seem so America first. And we already saw the consequences of this supposed America first policy when Donald Trump assassinated, when Donald Trump heeded the lobbying pressure campaign of Netanyahu and Mike Pompeo to assassinate Major General Qasem Soleimani. There was a de facto cover-up of how many U.S. service members at the Al-Assad base in Iraq suffered traumatic head injuries and had to be evacuated out to Ramstein Air Base in Germany for urgent treatment. In the next round, it's not going to be traumatic head injuries. There will be ships being sunk. There will be casualties to American soldiers. And we've seen with the USS Eisenhower, an aircraft carrier that has been at sea for the longest deployment, I think since World War II, of any battle carrier group, that the sailors are getting a little bit anxious and they're not really enjoying parrying missile attacks from the Ansar Allah de facto government of Yemen, the Houthis, and they're just sick of being at sea forever. This is sort of leaked out in the media through some social media postings of the soldiers. But what they don't understand, what they might start to understand, is that they're there to protect shipping routes from the Houthis in order to protect Israel's strategic depth. They're not actually protecting the United States. They're not protecting our shores. They're not advancing American interests. What would advance American interests and end the Houthi blockade, which would also end the Hezbollah attacks on northern Israel, is the U.S. president actually exerts some leverage and forces a ceasefire, which would be the easiest thing for an American president to do when you have in Israel its prime minister rushing to Washington to beg for weapons, because Israel cannot survive another day without these constant supplies of 2,000-pound bombs, thousands of tank shells, the 155 millimeter howitzer shells. It would have to negotiate for peace immediately without that. This all could have been ended with one phone call, but they won't do that. So the idea of Israel being America first, or being what Alexander Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State, called America's unsinkable aircraft carrier, hasn't fully been put to the test, because the United States has not directly engaged with Iran and Iran's allies, who have gotten more militarily sophisticated since, I would say, the last major war with an Iranian ally and Israel in 2006.
And finally, Max, what about Donald Trump himself? Purportedly, he's the big kingpin of the America First movement, right? Mike Pompeo just had another prime speaking role at the Republican convention. Donald Trump has gone on Fox News relatively recently and denounced anybody who has a skeptical interpretation of various aspects of the October 7th attack as the new Holocaust deniers. He has, at the debate, we played a clip earlier, he was attacking Joe Biden. Everybody was fixated on Biden's cognitive deterioration, so they may have missed that Trump tried to derisively call Biden a Palestinian, as though Biden hadn't been supplying these endless armaments to Israel for the past 9 months, and actually been a more generous provider of largesse to Israel than I think any president in U.S. history. But the critique from Trump and the Republicans is that actually Democrats are somehow pandering to the pro-Hamas faction of the party, which is like has all the political leverage or something. What do you anticipate for a second Trump administration? You mentioned John Hagee earlier. Do you know who gave the opening benediction at the inauguration of the new U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, which Trump brags to this day that he's the one who finalized? And it was attended by Jared Kushner and Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens even, and Friedman, the ambassador. Do you know who gave the opening benediction? Can you guess?
I don't remember. It was like Kenneth Copeland?
No, it was John Hagee. John Hagee.
It was John Hagee.
Pastor
I
John
thought it was
Hagee.
like somebody else.
John Hagee met frequently with Trump at the White House. Now, it's unlikely that Trump himself is a believing premillennial dispensationalist, right? But he has no qualm with elevating the most freakish, theologically blinkered adherents to that doctrine and giving them major roles of influence and even some policy related power in the administration. And there's every reason to think that that would proceed in a second administration, because Trump's going around and basically doing a version of when Biden in 2020 famously said, "You ain't black if you vote Republican or if you vote for Trump." Now Trump's basically saying, "You ain't Jewish if you vote for Democrats," because of Israel. So what are your forecasts for a second Trump term in terms of Trump's individual proclivities on the issue?
Yeah, I mean, if I were completely cynical and all I believed in was power, which seems to be Trump's mentality, then I would say that that's a brilliant ploy to tell Jewish voters in areas where they're heavily concentrated that Trump cares more about Israel than the Democrats do, and that for those who vote on the basis of Israel, which most Jews do not, that might be an effective appeal. And you can see Trump is gathering more Jewish support than previous Republican nominees had from that element. More like religiously observant, religious nationalist Jews. They love Trump. So why not do that? I mean, Trump's general strategy is to try to slice off as much as he can from various minority groups that had been core constituencies for the Democrats. Remember, in 2016, Donald Trump made an appeal, an explicit appeal in his own words, to the LGBTQ community, and he could barely read all the letters, but he got the alphabet soup down, and he said that I will protect you against Islamic terror because that's the number one threat to your community. So from a cynical point of view, what he's doing is smart. He's also trying to make sure that he keeps Miriam Adelson, the widow of the late casino baron Sheldon Adelson, whose wealth also sponsored the career of Benjamin Netanyahu, in his good stead. So he's got a $100 million pledge from Miriam Adelson's super PAC.
And Max, let me
so there's
interrupt
no
you for a
reason
second.
to believe.
of
Yeah.
Miriam Adelson, who was spotted in a VIP booth at the Republican convention. There she is. Doesn't she look fantastic? Yeah, that's her, and she's
Yeah, I
flanked
mean, that's
naturally by Ted
basically, and
Cruz.
Kushner.
Ted Cruz, Carrie Lake, and then Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia. So anybody who wants to ascend through Republican Party circles obviously wanted to be spotted with Miriam Adelson in her special little booth at the convention.
And she will direct the money against you, and she will use the money to destroy you. And Sheldon Adelson, as I reported at the Gray Zone, he was a CIA asset. We can assume that he's an Israeli intelligence asset. This is not just Miriam Adelson. She's a front for some of the more powerful elements in the world. And so there's no reason to think that Donald Trump would somehow decide to make a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We should believe him when he says that he would like to starve Iran, that he would like to cancel diplomacy with Iran. We should believe him. But at the same time, there's a problem, which is that if Donald Trump were president right now, I think these protests against the genocidal assault on Gaza would be much larger and more energetic because liberal organizations would have sent their constituents out into the street to try to make this bloody war and what has basically been a failed war for the Israelis all about Donald Trump, the same way that they tried to make the Iraq war all about Bush. And when you see Trump joined at the hip with Netanyahu, it's also bad for Netanyahu because Donald Trump doesn't do what Biden and Blinken are doing, where they're saying, oh, well, after this war is all over, we're going to work for a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. Trump is content to openly allow Netanyahu to annex the West Bank. And so the fantasy peace process that has always allowed Israel in a much more elegant way to put new facts on the ground, to build more settlements, and then blame the Palestinians for not wanting peace is gone. So he loses the media as well. So I think there's a danger there for Israel in the special relationship when both Trump and Netanyahu are joined at the hip together in office. And who comes after? Another question to consider is, I mean, Netanyahu's isolated right now. He's facing criminal trials, corruption trials, if the war ends and his coalition collapses. Everybody knows that. He feels desperate with a Democratic administration in office and would be disappointed if somehow Kamala won, regardless of how pro-Israel and how bought off by AIPAC she is. But so there's a good chance that Netanyahu could be leaving the scene at some point in the near future. I mean, he's the longest serving Israeli prime minister. What comes after Netanyahu? And what comes after Netanyahu is even weaker and more unstable than Netanyahu ever was. Netanyahu essentially is Israel right now. And so I think Israel is is kind of entering the abyss. And it's in a state of instability politically, but economically. It's heavily reliant on its tech industry, which is seeing dwindling investments from foreign venture capital firms that it depends on. Its population, especially more educated population, is leaving. Its population, which is more working class, cannot return to their homes in the north and the south. They're relying heavily on government subsidies. Its credit has been downgraded. It's in a real existential crisis, and it has no clear way out of this war where it's now directly not just facing Hamas and Hezbollah, but also the Houthis, and that could expand even further. So I think we need to look at this Netanyahu visit as just another day in the imperial decline, tragic comedic slasher flick that we've been watching for so long.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, with Trump in power, that acts as an accelerant on any organized liberal protest movement. So if Trump were the one presiding over the Gaza war for the past 9 months, you would probably have seen liberal NGOs realize that they can mobilize their resources to oppose U.S. foreign policy because they can personalize it as about Trump or right-wing fascism and how there's a commonality between the U.S. and Israel in that regard or whatever else. But with a Democrat in power, it does sap that protest activity. So it would have been like the 2020 George Floyd protests, but transferred into an Israel type scenario just because the presence of Trump really just acts as that fuel to the fire. Max, you reminded me that tomorrow on the show, I want to wear my new Trump-themed yarmulke that I received. I was honored to receive at the Republican convention last week. I think it would really befit the mood of the programming. So thank you for giving that reminder. And with that, Max, I want to thank you for joining us live from your car. You look swell. I hope I look good. We all look good. The viewers look good. Everybody looks good. So Max, nice job as always, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you. Yeah, I apologize for not being in my home studio, but next time.
Don't apologize. You have nothing to apologize for, Max. Never. Never give up, never surrender.
All right.
All right, Max Blumenthal,
Well,
thank you.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Yep.
Enjoy your time there.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.